Rimmer found Magruder sitting on a rock, staring across the canyon at the out-of-control gravity gales. Magruder turned to face him.
Made a bit of an ass of myself back there, sir. Fainting and what have you. Don't suppose you've ever fainted, sir. Not really on, is it? For a man.
Rimmer changed the subject, with a grating of gears. Understand you're an SCM?
Yes, sir. West Point, sir. Fought on the Hyperion in the Saturn War.
Rimmer shook his head in amiable disbelief. A Space Corps Marine? You're the guys who say, "Smoke me a kipper, I'll be back for breakfast," before embarking on some damn fool mission to save the solar system?
It's just space jock banter, sir.
And I understand you were decorated.
You've been an inspiration to me, sir. Always gave me something to look up to.
Yes, right. For a second, Rimmer was silent. Look, there's things we should talk about, things you've been told which aren't true.
Sir?
Your mother, she was a woman. A very remarkable woman. It can't have been easy bringing up a boy on geomapper's wages, getting you through college and into the academy. Some people, and I used to count myself among them, believe there's a class system, and someone like you, who doesn't have a completely pucker background, would never be admitted into such high-ranking company. That's bullshit. Your mother went out and proved that. She's a truly courageous, remarkable woman.
It's you who are my inspiration, sir.
Rimmer shook his head. You owe everything to her. She really made you into something, and you should be proud of... Rimmer looked over the canyon. When I tell you what she had to do to make you into that something, I don't want to hear you feel let down or resentful. I'm not going to lie to you. Do you mind if I call you Michael?
I'd be honoured, sir.
You can call me, if you want, sir, father or dad or whatever.
Really, sir?
Anyway, the thing is, I never really knew your mother. It was... Rimmer was going to say a one-night stand, but he couldn't say that to his son. What I'm saying is, I'm not who you think I am. I'm not special. In fact, you are everything I ever aspired to. Rimmer looked into his son's clear green eyes. I'm nobody, Michael. I could have been, even should have been, but I blamed all my failings and shortcomings on my parents, and that's a well that never runs dry.
She always said you were fantastically modest, sir.
Rimmer shook his head. I'm not modest. I'm not an officer either. It was always my great passion, but I never made it. Not good enough, you see. Your mother invented a father figure for you, to give you something to live up to. I'm just a technician. I never even managed to pass the astroengineering exam. Coming here today and telling you this is the only gutsy thing I've ever done in my whole life. An alloy of emotions passed across Magruder's face. An ugly mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and contempt.
You're a technician?
Yes.
What class?
Second, Rimmer mumbled quietly. That's beverage maintenance. Rimmer stood straight-backed. Yes. Magruder savaged him with a look of utter disparagement and stomped off back to the caves. Crichton glanced over his shoulder as he shuffled down the Starbug storage deck. He was alone. Excellent. He'd reached the far wall and stood before a multicoloured fascia. He typed an override code onto the keypad, and the door to the vault opened with a smoky sigh. He followed the alphabetically marked floor-to-ceiling expanse of storage drawers, making numerous lefts and rights before he reached the letter O. He pulled the sliding tubular aluminium stepladder underneath the storage box he desired and swiftly climbed the steps. Again he typed in a passcode. A box zinged out of the wall. He typed in a second passcode, and the box opened silently. He reached in and took hold of a vacuum flask, spun off the top, and took out a tiny pink disc. He hurried down the stepladder and made his way to the exit. All he had to do now was feed the Oblivion virus into his own network and walk across the canyon and meet the rage. When the Gestalt entered him, it too would become contaminated. Its energy force would be neutered by the electric killing virus. And although he would be terminated, the rage would be slain. He hurried down the aisle and walked into a bank of storage units. A dead end. In his musings, he'd missed a turn. He started to retrace his steps. He'd never noticed before how dark it was in the storage vaults. Just the low neons casting sober, orange fingers over the floors and walls. Left, right, left. He made a right and saw 2 feet sticking out behind a bale of storage drawers. Whose? It was impossible to tell. Crichton began the very long walk up to them. As he walked, he started to eliminate all the people those feet couldn't belong to. Long before he reached them, he knew whose they were. A stalactite of panic sliced through his being. Then a high-pitched squeaking noise made him spin round. It was the sound of the giant wheel on the reinforced steel doors being spun shut as the storage vault was locked from the outside. Michael Magruder sat huddled in front of an unnecessarily chirpy fire and tried to sift through the events of this quite unbelievable day. All his life he'd believed in this godlike father figure. All through his childhood, all through cadet school, all through the Starfleet he'd been plutonium driven to succeed, to live up to the unattainable. Now it turned out his father was nothing more than a chicken soup machine maintenance repairman. A second technician, for God's sake. A zero. He started to choke. He couldn't breathe. The garrote flashed over his head and dragged him backwards along the cave floor. He kicked helplessly, vainly trying to get his hands between the thin metal wire and the soft skin of his throat. Suddenly, gaffer tape was wrapped expertly across his mouth and round his head. Then he was rolled onto his front, and the tape was round his wrists, and then on his back again, and he could see his attacker. It was Lister. At least it looked like Lister. Rimmer stood in the mouth of the cave and watched bewildered as the 2 men rolled around in the dirt. Suddenly, the man sitting astride his son turned and saw him. Lister's other self. He was still alive. You! Lister's other self sprayed a staccato snigger into the chilling afternoon air. You just can't keep a bad guy down! A twinkle of gunmetal grey flecked into Rimmer's peripheral vision. 4 feet to his right lay Lister's other self's IR pistol. All he had to do was make 2 strides, bend and pick it up. This was his moment. 4 feet away, 2 strides, pick up the pistol and point it at Lister's head, bark out an order to get the hell off his goddamn son and march the punk out of the cave. He would still be a second technician. He'd still be a nobody who had never navigated his way up the ziggurat of command, but at least, in some small way, he'd have proved himself in front of Michael. Rimmer watched as Lister realised the rad pistol was nearer Rimmer than him. Rimmer grinned. This was his moment. He'd be a hero. And wouldn't that be sweet? Then a voice, somewhere inside Rimmer's head. Hero? Who the hell was he kidding? Any jerk could do what he was about to do. He was just lucky enough to chance along at the right time and find himself standing next to the pistol. It was hardly the stuff of the SMCs. He wasn't exactly Uziing the door in and walking behind a blazing bazookoid. Then he would have been a hero. But this was kiddie stuff. And anyway, why should he have to prove himself to Michael? His son would have to learn that there's more to life than being a great soldier. If they were to have any kind of relationship, he'd have to learn to care for Rimmer for what he was, with all his failings. And if he couldn't do that, unless his old man turned out to be Tommy Testosterone Space Marine, that was just tough. Lister's other self's foot lanced into Rimmer's solar plexus, and he hammered backwards into the cave wall, still enraptured by his own thoughts. Lister's doppelganger picked up the rad pistol, twirled the rad setting to neuter, and pointed it at Rimmer's groin. "On your feet." He jabbed a look at Magruder. "You two." The two men got to their feet. Magruder's eyes stood on tiptoe above an oblong of masking tape and drilled into Rimmer. He'd had a chance to take the guy out, and he'd botched it. What the hell else could you expect from a mookel who fixed chicken soup machines for a living? Crichton stared down at the 4 dead Kinatawaii tribespeople. They'd never left the ship. Lister's other self had regained consciousness at some point during the walk through the decom chamber, and had managed to overpower all 4 of them. Now he was out there somewhere, and the rage was only 15, perhaps 20 minutes away. He tapped the pink disc of the Oblivion virus on his open palm, the disc that was utterly useless while he was still locked in here. The door yawned wide, and Rimmer was shoved inside. It closed again. Rimmer started to explain. "He didn't leave." "I know, I've found the Kinatawais." "He's got Michael." "Sir, it's imperative we get out of here. I suggest we cover every inch of the storage vault to see if there's any possible escape route." "Haven't you already done that?" "Twice, sir," Crichton shrugged. "What else was there to do?" They began their search, first examining the locking mechanism on the vault door, and then following the walls round the room, looking for air vents. "I'm a father, you know. I still can't believe it." "I heard, sir. You must be very proud." "He's not. He's about as thrilled as Edward II when they started to heat up the poker." "Resenting their parents is the human way, sir. Black widow spiders eat their mates after sex. Humans blame their parents for all their failings. It's the characteristic which makes you lovably idiotic to all other species." "What are you saying, Crichton?" "Look!" "Yes?" Rimmer waited for him to make his point. "Look!" Crichton was pointing at the 4-inch-wide oxygeneration outlet pipe that surfaced by the pump housing in the corner of the vault. "It's an oxygeneration outlet pipe, so what?" "Sir, if I turned your light bee off and set it to delay timer, then brought it back online again, say 60 seconds later, we could push your light bee down the outlet pipe and it'd drop through to the quarters below. Or, alternatively, it could wind up in the oxygeneration unit itself, where I'd get minced." "The plan does have a downside, I must confess." "A downside? Is that what it is?" "However, if the scheme were to succeed, you'd rematerialize on the deck below and be able to sound the alarm. We could attempt to rescue your son, Michael." "No, I'm sorry. It's too risky." "Very well, sir." "And don't try and change my mind. It won't work." "No, sir." They walked along in silence for almost 20 seconds. "You're doing it on purpose, aren't you?" "Sir?" "You know what I'm talking about now. Just quit it. Talk or hum or whistle or something, but no more accusing silences. Got it?" "Yes, sir." "You're doing it again." "I can't think of anything to say, sir." "Hum, then." "Yes, sir. Permission to hum, sir." "Granted." Rimmer sighed impatiently. Crichton began humming a plaintive version of Danny Boy. Eventually, Rimmer caught on. "Oh, Danny Boy, the pipes are calling. I've seen mudguards on boy racer Mustangs that weren't as low as you." He exhaled and contemplated the floor. "Right, very well, okay. I must have less brains than the offspring of a village idiot and a TV weather girl. I'll do it." Several minutes later, Crichton unscrewed the outlet pipe's gauze cover and dropped the delay-timed bee down the tube. The bee clanged down the pipe, slaloming round corners, ricocheting down the colon of tubing, pinging back and forth across the narrow passageways as it fell. Finally, it bounced out of an outlet valve and rolled across the grilled flooring of Edek's gantry. It rolled across the 5-foot walkway before plummeting over the edge and smacking onto D-deck's gantry, and teetered on the edge of the grill overlooking the small sewage plant on C-deck. Spinning like a drunken room, it hugged the very edge of the walkway before it waltzed back into the middle of the gantry and spun to a halt. Seconds later, Rimmer burgeoned back into existence and found himself on the paint shop gantry on D-deck. He went to find the others. Kachansky and Lister piled the pallets of freeze-dried fruits onto the loading truck. Lister's other self gestured for them to drop the peaches as he yanked Magruder on a wire garrote across F-deck. "Better put me back on your Christmas card list, kids." "You left the ship with the Kinnatawawies. Crichton saw you." "No. He saw me enter the decom chamber." "You've been around since then?" asked Kachansky. "When we were on the Mayflower?" "Got messed up when I had an altercation with the Kinnatawawi. Couldn't make me come back until I'd healed up a little." He ripped the gaffer tape off Magruder's mouth. "Tell them what I want." "He wants the escape pod," Magruder wheezed through the choking wire noose. "You want it?" Kachansky spat. "Go and take it. There's no time to screw around. The Gestalt is going to be here in less than 15 minutes, and if that doesn't wipe us out, the crossing into the Omnizone will." Lister's other self grinned. "You can come with me, doll. Plenty of room for you if we scrunch up." Kachansky eyed him narrowly. "I wouldn't go with you if you were the last guy in the universe." "I'm going to be." Lister's other self smiled. "Certainly the last guy around here who can have children." Without warning, he pointed the rad pistol at Lister's crotch and fired a volley of radiation into his groin. Lister hit the floor, clutching himself. "Because from this moment on, your boyfriend's as sterile as a surgeon's scalpel." Kachansky fell by his side. Lister's other self stood over her and pointed the rad pistol into the middle of her forehead. "I'm going to ask you one last time for a date. If the answer's still no, something really tragic's going to happen. So, what do you say? Want to be my Eve? I'll buy you a fig leaf." "Go screw a dog." Lister's other self shook his head sadly as he recocked the pistol. Kachansky sucked her right index finger. "You evil bastard," she said quietly. "Say hi to Jesus for me." He pulled the trigger. Rimmer hurried along the paint shop gantry. Several floors above, he could make out a vague mix of voices. He reached the hatchway and discovered it was locked. He doubled back and tried the hatchway at the opposite end of the gantry. That was locked too. He was trapped. For several minutes he ransacked the shelves of equipment looking for help. Then he turned up one of the Mayflower's old Astro strippers Crichton had bought from the Kinnatawawies. He unhooked it from the shelf and laid it out on the floor. The harness was intended to be worn over the shoulders. The front had a brutal-looking torch gun funnel that jetted flames 60 feet, while the back had a second funnel that threw out a power jet so the pilot could transport himself around the outside of the ship when preparing the metal for new paintwork. Rimmer checked the tanks. Both booster and flame tank were a quarter full. More than enough for him to torch his way through the hatchway lock. He hauled the harness over his head and tried to click the buckles closed. The harness webbing wouldn't reach. 5, maybe 6 inches short. Who'd last worn this? A hugely overweight pygmy? He adjusted the straps to their maximum length and tried again. Still, he couldn't press the stud key into its buckle. Maybe, if he did just the top one, that would hold it. It did. Just. He looked for the control stick. It was behind his back, near the booster funnel. Who had designed this thing? He swiveled the joystick and clicked on the strip of flame. But instead of a controlled jet of flame pouring out of the funnel on his chest plate, his rear booster flared into life and propelled him 20 feet backwards across the gantry corridor, over the railing and into the 300-yard drop before it politely clicked off, leaving him to plummet groundwards. He had the damn thing on backwards. Blindly, He fumbled about with the joystick, trying to guide the human fireball he'd now become as he ricocheted off the hull walls and powered upwards. Lister's other self stood over the motionless body of Christine Kochanski as she lay on the floor. Her lagoon blue eyes were open, wide and defiant. She licked her right index finger, called him a bastard, and watched him pull the trigger. There was a hollow click as the rad pistol's chamber jammed. Kochanski stroked the neck of the tube that hung around her neck and licked her finger again. He fired. Hollow click. Jammed again. He fired a third time. Same. She licked her finger and looked up at him, almost smiling. Then he realised. The bitch was taking the luck virus. He held her hand down by her side. No luck virus this time, sweetie. He started to squeeze the trigger again. Then something happened. A strange, roaring noise distracted him. He looked out over the gantry rail. Suddenly, in a roasting typhoon of dust, a mighty bird rose into view, vomiting flame. The twin jets of flame powered over the group in a sting of singed hair. The phoenix screamed off along the length of the gantry before it turned, and to the accompaniment of a screaming man, strafed them a second time. Lister's other self dived headlong behind a pile of almond crates, dragging Magruder with him. Once again, the fireball, dressed in an impenetrable coat of smoke and flame, ping-ponged down the length of the deck. Lister's other self watched it go. What the hell is that? Magruder turned to look at his captor. That's my pop. Your what? And you better look out, mister, because he's come for his boy. Rimmer's wails of terror were buried under the booster's roar as he ricocheted off 3 cargo bay walls and scorched the gantry floor with a new orange carpet of fire. A banshee wail, a deafening whoosh, and the 4 almond crates imploded in a series of pretty blue and red mushrooms. Magruder whooped in delight. Lister's doppelganger dropped the garrote and dived for cover. Rimmer cannoned down the deck, smacked into the far wall, scraped a ceiling joist, and started to make the return journey. Lister's other self walked to the middle of the gantry floor. He placed both his hands on the butt of his pistol to steady it, and took careful aim. 2 rad bolts sizzled past the astrostripper and exploded in muffled yelps in the far hull wall. 20 yards away, Kochanski huddled with Lister behind a forklift truck. He's aiming for his light bee, Lister croaked. Rimmer fumbled behind his back and angled left to avoid the first one and right to avoid the second. Slowly but surely, he was mastering the controls. Hell. He was almost beginning to enjoy it. Almost. He looked down at Michael, who stood behind a crate of burning almonds, his face blackened like a Caribbean red snapper, gazing adoringly up at him. 2 more rad bolts hissed towards him. Again he dodged left and right. Lister's other self steadied the pistol and waited until Rimmer was almost on top of him. Rimmer powered down once more and squeezed off the extra jet. Lister's other self released his next 2 bolts. The second hawked into Rimmer's shoulder, causing his body to go into an electric spasm as the light beam fought to restore normal transmission. When it cleared, Lister's other self was crumpled on the floor, his rad pistol abandoned as he tried to put out the blaze that was engulfing his right arm. Rimmer had scored a direct hit. He peered down and saw Michael standing in an aisle of flaming crates, waving up at him, wearing a giant grin. He scorched around the cargo bay once more, banking right around a tight corner before looping and levelling out again. At last he'd done something right. He caroomed around the cargo bay a final time as Lister and Kochanski hollered up at him. Another flaming loop-de-loop. He could really drive this thing. He glanced at his shoulder. The frazzled belt buckle had started to shear. Again. Now it was only hanging to his body by 5 thin strands of cotton, and he was 60 feet from the ground, screaming round the cargo bay at 60 miles an hour. The astro stripper slipped off his left shoulder. He dropped 30 feet before he managed to haul the shoulder harness back on again. 3 strands. He had to land. Lister's other self sculled along the floor and grabbed hold of the discarded rad pistol. He needed that astro stripper. It was the only means of escape. He squeezed the trigger. The rad bolt hummed through the air and hit the light beam full on. It erupted in a sad blue flare. Rimmer's image corrupted and shut down, and what remained of the carcass of his bee fell to the ground with a hollow clunk. Magruder staggered across to where Lister's other self was, slumped against the crate, and hit him over the head with his 2 bound hands. His screams and sobs swirled around the cargo bay before they were drowned by a new sound. The sound of the rage. It was upon them. Its wind seared through the cargo decks and began to engulf them. Minutes later, they were all baptized in hatred, saturated with the Gestalt's malevolence, pulverized by a fury that whispered to each of them of some dreadful, intangible injustice that was never made clear. Then it was gone, swirling off the ship and continuing its cattle drive of virulence across the planet's surface. Lister stood. "We have to form a circle of Sakafakeri." The 4 of them sat in a tight circle and held hands. Lister gazed across at Kachansky, and she returned his scared smile. One of the 4 would die. One of them would be taken by the rage. Lister's other self gazed at Kachansky, amused by her fear. His eyes dropped down her body, drawn by 2 small test tubes hanging round her neck. The look virus. He thrust himself backwards to create some slack, and then yanked himself forward. His tongue flicked over her skin before he scooped the tubes into his mouth and ripped the chain from around her neck. His teeth crunched triumphantly through the tube into the sweet-tasting liquid. He felt its sparkling force twinkle through his body. Now he was safe. The rage would choose another. The rage entered him, but he wasn't concerned. He knew it would pass him by, and so it did, as it went round, faster and faster, growing in power, growing in strength. Now it was in Magruder, and then Kachansky, and then Lister, and then back again. It was in him once more. He felt its power, and tasted its awesome promises. Then it left him, and entered Magruder. But he wanted it to stay, to possess him, to engorge him with its power. He wanted the rage. They all wanted the rage. Soon they were all screaming, pleading with it to choose them. But only one of them had taken the look virus, and the look virus made your dreams come true. The rage chose him. He let out a sob of ecstasy and felt the full onslaught of its power before his body was seared by an acid wind that cleaned him of his flesh. His bones tumbled to the ground. Magruder picked up his father's devastated light beam. The minute holographic projection device rolled across his open palm, mutilated beyond repair. He would have given anything to have had a few precious minutes with him, to make his peace. Now it was too late. He was gone. Lister pulled himself upright. The pain in his groin had faded into a bearable ache. But he'd never have children now. Suddenly, the ground shook. The planet was minutes away from the event horizon. They scrambled down the disembarkation ramp, cranked on the astrostripper's back boosters, and were soon speeding across the planet's surface in search of the cat, Retrokrebin, and the others. They found them making their way down the valley towards the sanctuary of caverns. The cat scanned the group of 3. Where's Goalpost Head? Magruder held out Rimmer's broken light bee. Man, was all the cat was able to say. The night was ravaged by glowering thunderclouds, driven across a whiskey-sodden moon. Lister took out his unoculars and studied the entrance of the limestone caverns 600 feet below. Above the entrance, like a guard dog, the rage swirled in a tight, protective circle. It was back in position. Crichton checked the Geiger reading.
If we're not 1,500 feet below in 5 minutes' time, we're all going to wind up with less life than a Cornish discotheque.
But how do we navigate our way past the rage? Asked the cat. Crichton unscrewed a vacuum-sealed flask and took out a small pink disc. The Oblivion virus?
The rage is an electrical energy force. In theory, the Oblivion virus has the capability to disarm its electrical charge. So if we can infect the rage, we can incapacitate the Gestalt.
But how? Asked Kachansky.
Someone would have to... Sir, my death will allow you to enter the caverns where you have an 11-4 chance of survival.
What's that? Rex Krebin pointed to Magruder's pocket, where a tiny, faint orange glow was permeating the cloth. Magruder hauled the light bee from his pocket. A tired glow emanated from the bee in a series of flashes. Flash, 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 pause. Flash, flash, and again. What's it doing? Asked Magruder.
My God, said Kachansky. He's talking to us in Morse code.
She's right, said Magruder. The light bee had started to flash again. Dot, dash, dash. W-E-A-K. Weak, weak. N-O-T, not. M-U-C-H, much, not much. T-I-M, not much time. G-I-V-E, give, give me. Kachansky blinked away a lens of tears.
I know what he's going to say.
He's proposing we use it to transfer the virus. The light bee did a tired little loop-de-loop to signify that was exactly what it was proposing. The virus was loaded into the computer and transferred into the bee.
Sir,
Crichton threw the bee into the air.
Godspeed.
The bee floated around in an unsteady circle before it straightened and headed off across the plain towards the malevolent Gestalt. They stood and watched as the light bee wended its way shakily across the tract of gnarled plain, over the blackened, holocaustic stumps of petrified woodlands, over the desiccated fingers of dead riverbeds, over a landscape that had once been lush and joyous, but was now a shriveled, embittered wasteland. Finally, the bee hovered, teetering on the edge of the rage's bitter winds, almost as if it were having a change of heart. Lister aimed the unoculars across the canyon. He stopped. He can't go through with it. The gravity gale howled through their guts as the light bee paused and then started to flash a new message. S-M-A-K-I-B, B again, F-B. S-M-A-K-I-B-B-F-B. What does that mean? Asked the cat. Lister shook his head. S-M-A-K-I-B-B-F-B.
Smoke me a kipper. I'll be back for breakfast.
Magruder smiled. The bee powered into the heart of the rage. The rage erupted in an extended volley of blood-black explosions that lacerated the plain. Gargantuan light bulbs of fire plumed skyward, accompanied by the agonized screechings of 1,000,000 dying creatures. All the Gelfs who'd been forced to surrender their lives and their identities to create the Gestalt. All had been poisoned by recrimination and resentment. All had vented their spleen through the power of the Gestalt. But now their fury was over. Their pain had ended. They were free to die. The rage was dead. The gravity wind smashed Lister and the others against the rock face as they ran along the mountain pathway towards the sanctuary of the caverns. Once in, they ran past falling boulders and schisming floors, past breaking stalactites and flooding underground rivers, deeper and deeper, further and further into the ground. Finally, the planet was hauled into the aureole of black holes, and a series of tremors hurtled through the subterranean chambers, sending massive chasms zigzagging towards them. Leaping left and left again, they continued their flight into the planet's core, until the gravitational pummeling the planet was receiving from the Omnizone was nothing but a distant rumble. It took them 3 weeks to burrow their way to the surface. Lister gazed skyward. A bashful sun hung back behind a gang of cloud. He filled his lungs with air. It smelt as fresh as ice. They had made the crossing into a new dimension. Which dimension, it was impossible to tell. Kachansky pointed down the length of the canyon. Rivers crossed and skipped along its length like playful children. The first signs of a new, greener kind of vegetation were beginning to peek through the sandy soil. Crichton pulled the healer disc from his belt pocket and tapped it quizzically against his chest plate. Then, wordlessly, he started towards the caverns, trailed by the cat, Magruder, and Retrocreben. Their heads stooped low. They scoured the ground, looking for a small, dead, light bee. Lister looked at Kachansky through panda eyes. "We're home." She kissed him. They clambered down the canyon and started to walk alongside a flood river that gambled across the valley, past the purple flowers of meadow saffron. It felt like it was spring. He smiled a heavy smile. "We don't need kids to make us happy, hun. We've got us." "I know. But I just feel I screwed it up. I had a responsibility to restart the human race, and I blew it. Let me show you something." She tugged off her loosely buttoned mauve shirt and pulled her t-shirt over her head. "You know you never plan ahead. You live for now and hope everything works itself out. Personally, I think that's kind of cute, but then I have major character flaws of my own. What are you talking about? Planning ahead. You never do." She grinned. "Lucky, then, you got yourself entangled with a gal who does." She slipped her hand into her bra cup and pulled out a small 1-inch vial. "You've also got a memory like a sieve. I took a second vial of luck virus, remember?" A slow smile started to break across Lister's face. "I can see you're ahead of me." She took a swig and handed it to Lister. "Here's the deal." She picked up 2 flat stones and handed one to him. "If we can both skim these 2 stones down the river so that they can each bounce 7 times and wind up in that little oxbow pond over there, it means—" She pointed to the edge of the canyon, where a skirt of sorghum grass was swaying in the breeze. "When we hit the long grass over there, we're going to wind up making the first of our many children." Lister swigged from the luck virus. "You ready?" "I'm ready." They took aim and fired. The pebbles landed simultaneously and perfectly on the surface of the river. They bounced once, twice, 3 times, 2 feet apart and still in perfect unison. 4 times, 5 times, still together. 6 times, still in absolute synchronicity. Almost as if they were bound together by some invisible cord. 7 times, still as one. Up they went a final time before they touched down in the little oxbow pond in a harmonious chord of simultaneous plops. Lister and Kachansky swiveled and looked at one another, wearing monkey grins that were almost too big to fit on their faces. They hugged and screamed and yelled and hollered. Then gradually, the grin faded from Lister's face. He picked her up in his arms and stared into her eyes. He was disemboweled by her diamond brightness. He was mesmerized by her beauty. She kissed him on his bottom lip. He started to carry her across the canyon towards the leaning choirs of tall grass. He carried her over the streams, over the sand estuary, past the meadow saffron, until finally they were there, walking through the yellow blades of maize. They melted down into the sorghum grass and disappeared from view. Slowly, gently, almost imperceptibly, the grass began to sway.